Hey everyone, this is Scott here. I'm the guy who wrote the matrix solver in Factory Planner and just wanted to give a quick tutorial on how it works. So right now this is just base Factorio, no mods other than Factory Planner. So right now we're just going to keep it simple and look at a couple examples in base game where we might want to use it, and then from there we'll go look at some more complicated examples in C-Block, because there's a few things that it can do that don't really show up in base game that are more useful for some of the more complicated mods. So we're going to go look at C-Block and kind of see how it would work in there. But first, base game. In base game, you don't really need the matrix solver all that much. There are a couple places where you can use it. So for example, because as long as your recipes, if they just have simple inputs, simple outputs, no loops or byproducts, then you're not going to need it. The one example in base game where you would need it is, let's say you're trying to make petroleum, right? So let's go ahead, make a new subfactory. We'll call that petroleum, and there's our petroleum. Let's say we were trying to make like 1,000 petroleum a minute or something, right? So there's petroleum, put in 1,000, and let's see what we need. So if we were using basic oil processing, you can see that we only need, about 2 oil refineries. And turning the matrix solver on and off is not going to do anything because this is a simple recipe. We've just got one input, one output, so we don't really need a matrix solver for that. But if we were to use advanced oil processing, so now we could see that we're actually not getting the full value out of our crude oil, because we know that these byproducts can also get turned into petroleum. Because right now it's saying we need 1.8K crude oil a minute, and we need 1.5 oil refineries. So let's go ahead and try to recycle these byproducts and see what we get. So we're going to have to turn on our matrix solver. So if we click that, we do heavy cracking, click that, we do light oil cracking. Now we can see, wait, we only need slightly over 1,000 crude oil for 1,000 petroleum, and we don't even need 1 oil refinery. We do need a few chemical plants, but once you get those in, then now you can get basically the full value of your crude oil. So that's one example where the matrix solver will let you recycle some of your byproducts into your final product. Another example where the matrix solver can help in base Factorio is with uranium processing. So I'll just call this subfactory, call it uranium. And let's say we were trying to make some U-235. So U-235 is kind of difficult to make. Let's say we're trying to make 100, I don't know. So if we do 100 U-235, if you did it with just centrifuges and uranium ore, you're going to need a ridiculous number of centrifuges for that to work. But we know that with the Kovarex enrichment process, you can actually get way more U-235 by converting it from U-238. So let's go ahead and recycle this byproduct into some more uranium-235 using Kovarex. So that's a bit more like it. We actually don't need thousands of centrifuges, although I did pick a pretty high number here, so we still need a few hundred. But you can see, it is giving you the right ratios. So if we made this a bit smaller, something like 10, now you can see, wait, we only need we need 6 centrifuges on processing, and then we need 10 centrifuges on Kovarex. So that's pretty interesting. Like, these are actually, the same order of magnitude. You need a few for this, a few for that, and you can actually get the exact ratios for these two recipes using the matrix solver. So I think that's about it for base Factorio. Let's go ahead and jump into Cblock and look at some more complicated examples. This is going to take a while to load, so there's a million mods. Okay, let's go ahead and start a new game in Cblock. Well, let's not actually begin a new game because this mod takes forever. So quick things you can make here. Probably the simplest example I'd start with is making slag. So if we make slag, the way that you make slag is with electrolyzers. So if you've never played Cblock, basically what happens is you pump water out of the ground, and then you turn that water, you run it through an electrolyzer, and you make oxygen and hydrogen and a little bit of leftover slag, and then that slag you essentially use to do everything else in the game. So that slag, you can turn it into mineral sludge, turn that into iron, copper, everything else, whatever. So if we make slag, you can see we need about 7 electrolyzers to make 100 slag per minute. And we've got these byproducts here, right? We've got a little bit of extra oxygen, a little bit of extra hydrogen, and one of the cool things you can do in Cblock is you can actually get rid of excess items or fluids completely using things called flare stacks and clarifiers. So your flare stacks will get rid of your gases, and your clarifiers will get rid of your liquids. So if we click on our byproducts, we'll first turn on the matrix solver. We click on oxygen, and that can get voided straight through a flare stack. And we can see we don't even need a whole flare stack to get rid of that oxygen. And same thing with hydrogen. So there you go. This tells you how many flare stacks or clarifiers you might need to get rid of any excess byproducts. So let's go ahead and do maybe a more complicated example. This is actually going to be a pretty big jump up in terms of complexity, but let's go ahead and do mineral sludge. So mineral sludge is one of the main ingredients that you need kind of early mid-game, well, after you get past, slag processing. Mineral sludge basically gets condensed into these different ores, and then those ores can get crushed and mixed together to make your iron and your copper and everything else. But making mineral sludge, this is actually one of the more complex recipe chains in the game. It's got a lot of loops, a lot of byproducts, a lot going on. So we're going to try and work through some of that. So let's make some mineral sludge. I'll put in, let's put in like 5,000. So the very first recipe that you can use for mineral sludge is this slurry coal filtering. And what that does is basically you take these charcoal filters and you take this slag slurry and you take some purified water, and those get turned into mineral sludge. And then you also get these filter frames as one of your byproducts. And there's basically there's a loop where you take charcoal frames and you put charcoal on them, and that turns them back into charcoal frames. And those charcoal filters get used here to, I guess, purify your messy slag slurry into your more refined mineral sludge. And then the other thing too that we make is we get this sulfuric wastewater as a byproduct. So actually, let's go ahead and make slag slurry for our second step. And the way you make slag slurry is you basically take crushed stone and you mix it with sulfuric acid. Now, one of the things you'll probably notice is there's two things here that both involve sulfur. There's sulfuric wastewater and there's sulfuric acid, right? And this is a byproduct and this is an ingredient. And in C-Block, you can actually form a loop. There's a few more recipes in between, but you can basically make a loop with these things. And that loop is sulfur positive, right? So as long as you're taking all of your sulfuric wastewater, feeding it back into your sulfuric acid, then you'll always have a little bit of extra sulfur at the end. And you can put it in a tank, you can put it in a flare stack or clarifier, and then you're good to go. So let's go ahead and set up that loop using the matrix solver. So let's turn this on. If we click here, we're going to have to show unresearched recipes because this is a new game. So the way that you recycle sulfuric wastewater is with this sulfuric wastewater purification, and it happens in a hydro plant. So let's go ahead and click that, and oh no, we need a free item. So this is probably the thing that confuses the most people whenever they try to first use the matrix solver. Matrix solver, it's not that smart, right? It'll do exactly what you tell it to, but it doesn't know what it is you're trying to do. It just sort of works based on a very simple set of algorithms. Under the hood, what it's doing is it's setting up a list of equations with a list of variables, and in order for the solver to work, it needs the number of equations to exactly match the number of variables. Now, sometimes it might think that there's one too many variables or not enough variables, and then it will complain at you and say, look, I can't solve this because the variables and the equations, they don't match. So what are free items exactly? So basically, a free item is something that you are not constraining its input or its output. So kind of just backing up, when the solver runs, whenever you click a recipe in Factory Planner and you've got all these intermediate recipes, anything that you have that happens to both be an input and an output somewhere in your entire subfactory, it will by default try to zero that out. So most of the time that's fine, that's what you want, right? But sometimes you'll have things that happen to be an input and also happen to be an output that maybe you don't want to zero out. Maybe eventually you do, but as you're setting up your subfactory right now with what we've got with our current recipes, you might not want it to be zeroed out just yet. Okay? So whatever we click here is not going to get zeroed out, and the other two things will get zeroed out. Okay? So we can use that to try to figure out what does it make sense to click on. Okay, so first, obviously, you probably don't want to click mineral sludge, right? If you do that, you're basically gonna tell the subfactory, okay, I'm okay with mineral sludge being an ingredient, right? But if mineral sludge is an ingredient, well, that's the thing we're trying to make. So it's just gonna say, okay, we're just gonna have 5K mineral sludge, that's your ingredient, problem solved. And it's like, wait, no, that's not what we want. We wanted to actually make our mineral sludge, from all these other stuff. So that's no good, so we'll get rid of that. Okay, what about sulfuric wastewater? Do we want that to be our free item? And we do eventually, right? But we're not going to do it just yet because we'll do it once we complete our sulfur loop, but we still haven't finished that yet. Because if we click this, basically what we're saying is that we want purified water to get zeroed out. That doesn't really make sense yet, right? Because let's back up. What do we have so far? Well, so far we know that purified water is still one of our ingredients. We haven't made it yet. We might eventually, but right now this is one of our raw ingredients to this subfactory. And if we go back and look at the recipe for sulfuric wastewater purification, you'll notice that purified water is one of the outputs. What this means is that by default, since it's showing up as an output here and an input here, by default it will try to zero that out. But we don't want that to get zeroed out just yet, right? I mean, we'll be happy with the little bit of extra purified water we get from this, purification. But we know that we'll probably still need to make up the difference later on with filtering seawater. So that basically just leaves purified water, which we've already went over. We know that this is what we want to right now still be one of our ingredients, and then we'll fix that later. In fact, we can fix this now, right? Let's just go ahead and make purified water. And you can see this is making an extra 2.8K. This is needing 5K. So we actually don't even need as much in this case, right? So let's go ahead and, so the way that you normally get purified water in C-Block is you just take water out of the ocean and you run it through a desalination plant, or a hydro plant in this case, right? And then you can get your water from just a regular water pump. So purified water, that's good, right? And we can go ahead and finish up our sulfur recycling. So this sulfur, like the actual crystal sulfur, you can turn into sulfur dioxide gas. And then the sulfur dioxide gas, you can turn back into sulfuric acid, which, if you remember, that was the ingredient into our filtration units in order to make the final product. Okay, so now that we've got our loop of sulfur finished, we realize that we do need another free item. This tends to happen every time you close a loop, because every time you close a loop, you've basically reused all those ingredients one more time than the number of equations that you have. So something in the loop is going to have to be a free item. It'll either be an ingredient or an output. You may know ahead of time, you might not. Sometimes there's even loops where it actually comes out to zero, but in order for the solver to work, remember that the solver is not that smart, so if there's any loop at all, even if it solves to zero, it'll still technically need a free item. Okay, so what do we want to pick in this case? Well, this is a sulfur loop, so we'll probably want something with sulfur. Again, obviously we don't want to pick mineral sludge because that's our main output. If we pick that, then we're just making that an ingredient. That doesn't make sense. We don't want to do that. If we pick slag slurry, I'm not sure why that's showing up here. Oh, I guess because it is an ingredient here. It's an output here. So the solver isn't smart enough to know that we want to zero this out. Actually, this is 5.3. Oh yeah. So if we made that a free item, it's saying, look, we've perfectly balanced our sulfur loop and we have a little bit of extra slag slurry. And it's like, well, we don't really want that. And this is interesting, actually, because it does mean that you could set up your sub-factory to perfectly zero out your sulfur, and then you can void your slag slurry and it's still a valid sub-factory. Although in C-Block you actually need sulfuric acid for a lot of other things, so it's usually not a bad idea to just put this into a storage tank and then void the sulfur rather than voiding your slide slurry. So let's go ahead and make sulfuric acid our byproduct. And again, since this is a sulfur positive loop, so we're actually ending up with more sulfur each time it goes through this loop. And then, in order to be completely automated, if we just put it into a storage tank that could fill up eventually, which that's not good because then it stops up our factory, so we can actually void our sulfuric acid. So we put that in a flare stack, and now we're good to go. We can also go ahead and finish up the rest of these. Like we can void, this saline water that we are making because we needed purified water. That can go to a clarifier. We can void this mineralized water, which we're making because, well, that just comes out of our sulfur reprocessing. We don't need that, so that goes to another clarifier. We still need stone. I mean, yeah, this is getting a bit long. Like, for the matrix solver stuff, you don't have to worry about that. And then, I guess the last thing I'll mention is this charcoal filter and this filter frame. So, here again, like, there's a loop involved. So you can take your filter frame and then put some charcoal on it, and that turns it back into a charcoal filter. So if we click that, let's see which one. Yeah, we want this one. So now it's going to complain. Why? Because we have a loop. Every time we have a loop, we're going to have a free item, and we have to tell the solver which item we want to be free. And whatever item we pick at the end, when everything's solved, that's going to be an ingredient or a byproduct. Now, in this case, it actually doesn't matter what we pick, and because it's going to get solved to 0 anyway, but the solver didn't know that. The solver didn't know it was going to solve to 0. It just said, look, I've got, this many equations, this many variables, and I need a free item to work. So you have to still pick one. But there you go. And look, we've recycled all of our byproducts, and all of this stuff is getting flare stacked and clarified and put through this loop. And once you've got this, you can go out and say, okay, maybe I want 10,000 mineral sludge, and this will tell you, like, look, you actually need 2 hydro plants for these, or maybe you need 2 of these factories, but you only need 1 clarifier for these. And it's really nice once you've got everything worked out with a matrix solver, because then you know, like, all these very precise ratios for all these things that get recycled and flared and all that stuff. So I think that's pretty much it. Hopefully that explained it pretty well. I know this it can still get a little confusing, and sometimes even I'll still sometimes run into a free item where I'm like, wait, which of these do I pick? And then you have to go back and think a little. But once you kind of understand like what it's doing under the hood, it makes it a little easier to, figure out, okay, which things you want to pick for your free items and all that stuff. So hopefully that helps, and have a good day.